If everyone can hear me, then good afternoon. I'm very pleased to announce that our speaker today is Dennis Hackethal, who is a software engineer, artificial intelligence researcher, and author of the book A Window on Intelligence. And today he will speak about the role of replicators in creativity, a topic on which Dennis has written for Conjecture Magazine in an article called the Neo-Darwinian Theory of Mind, which we've linked to on Twitter and which we'll link to in the video as well. And I should also say that I think Conjecture Magazine is open to pitches from writers, for those of you who are interested in possibly contributing an article to the website. And in general, I also really recommend checking out Conjecture Magazine. I think it's a great initiative. And yeah, with that introduction, I give the floor to Dennis. Dennis, thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to your talk.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. It was very nice of you to invite me. And I should also mention Logan Chipkin, who I think is behind this. So shout out to him as well.
Yeah, shout out to Logan.
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about what I call the Neo-Darwinian theory of the mind. Before I start, I should say that to give credit where credit is due, I'm indebted to Karl Popper and David Deutsch, because without their epistemological work, I could never have thought of what I'm about to tell you. And also Richard Dawkins, who's influenced my thinking on evolution quite a bit. And it occurred to me recently that maybe the Neo-Darwinian theory of the mind is much too grand a term. I think maybe it should be called the Neo-Darwinian aspect of the mind, or the Neo-Darwinian approach to the mind, or something like that. I think that'd be a better name, because I think theories of the mind are a dime a dozen, and none of them work. And otherwise, we could already build AGI, artificial general intelligence, and so it might be better to choose a smaller name than that. But also, there's some construction going on outside, so apologies if you hear anything, if there's any noise. But yeah. So the meat of the theory of the approach, or whatever you want to call it, is very simple. But it does take just a moment to kind of sneak up on it. And so in the Popperian fashion, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with some problems. Some problems that I like to think that the theory or the approach solves are, for example, one, how does the mind create new conjectures? Two, how does memory work? Which includes things like, why do we forget things? Why are memories so unreliable? Why do some memories last longer than others? Those kinds of things. How did people evolve? And then lastly, I want to give, by no means any theories, just some small pointers for why I think we are conscious of some things and not of others. It's interesting to note that originally I only set out to solve the problem of how people evolved. And then I later found that this approach also allows me to solve these other problems. So I only have a few slides. This is the last slide. I'll leave this open. I want to give, I actually want to start in biology. And then I'll tie this back in with the mind later on. I promise they're related. And I'd like to talk about the origin of life for a moment. And many have said that what happened there was so unlikely and incredible, it's almost too good to be true that happened. And as far as I understand it, there are still some mysteries around it, what exactly happened there. But there are some good explanations that I think give us a pretty good idea of what may have happened. And the theory that I subscribe to is called the RNA world hypothesis. And the idea is basically that, you know, a long, long time ago when the Earth had just formed, the oceans, they were still highly chemically active. And there were molecules forming spontaneously in those oceans and disintegrating, and it was a big mess. It was a big chaos in this so-called primordial soup. And what some of those molecules were is they were enzymes, they were chemical catalysts. And what that means is that they were able to, they were able to cause a change in other molecules, for example, while retaining the ability to cause those changes again at a later time. They didn't undergo any changes themselves. And So what happened then, so it is said, that some of these molecules happened to cause chemical reactions that produced some of their own components. So that in this primordial soup, over time, you would get more and more of the building blocks of which these molecules themselves were made. And so what I'm kind of sneaking up on is the role of replication in biological evolution. And because once these molecules, once these enzymes get targeted enough, it makes sense to call them replicators. Because that is what they end up doing. They create a copy of themselves. So the idea is that this way, gradually, we get replication happening in the primordial soup. But this alone isn't enough for evolution to occur. You also need variation and selection. But I think once you have replication, variation is bound to happen sooner or later, because replication is not going to be perfect forever. And sooner or later, the replicator is going to make a mistake during replication. And this is what introduces variance. And what you get then is you have, if the variant is even fit enough still to keep replicating, what you get then is you have a slightly different kind of replicator. And if that is still able to replicate, now what you're getting is you're getting two different pockets of this population. One pocket of the population is still the old replicator, the copies of that replicator, and the new pocket of the population is this new kind of replicator. And so then the question is, well, which one is better at replicating than the other? These differences in the rate of replication is what we call selection. I think Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Selfish Gene, I think he uses the technical term is the non-random differential reproduction rate or something. Usually, because a replicator is already adapted to replicating, that means that any variant, if a mutation is going to occur, more often than not, it's going to be worse at replicating. So usually you could expect that if the replicator mutates, the mutant variant is going to have a harder time replicating. Because by definition, this is how William Paley, I think, defined adaptation. Something is adapted to something, for example, replication, that by definition means that if you make any slight change to it, it's going to get worse. It's very difficult to get it to make it better. But every now and then, a mutation can lead to a benefit. And by benefit, I don't mean that there's some well-meaning force in the biosphere. It just means that it helps the variant spread through the population of replicators at the expense of its rivals. And I think it's important to keep things simple when it comes to the theory of evolution. Really, all that the replicator wants to do, I say in scare quotes, it's not a conscious being, but all the replicator wants to do is spread through the population of replicators. It's all it cares about. And sometimes in service of that goal, complex adaptations can arise. Now, what is, so I'm going to start tying this back in with the mind now. Karl Popper said that the information that is stored in such replicators is adapted. And so therefore it's knowledge. Adapted information is knowledge, or maybe that particular phrasing originated with David Deutsch. And Popper's conjecture is that people also create human knowledge by evolution. So evolution in that sense is not limited to the biosphere, excuse me, although there are important differences between biological evolution and the evolution that occurs in our minds. There are strong parallels between them. And so Popper offered this analogy of a new conjecture that people come up with being analogous to the mutation of a gene, and criticism being analogous to the selection of a gene. And the old theories that we derive knowledge from the senses, for example, which is empiricism, or that we create them by extrapolating repeated observations, which is inductivism, those are completely false, as Popper explained. And instead, he argued that we create knowledge by starting with problems, not with observations. which are conflicts between ideas, as David Deutsch defines them. And then we guess solutions to these problems, and we criticize them until we hopefully come up with a solution that we deem good enough to adopt tentatively. And this is not only scientific knowledge that grows that way. All human knowledge grows that way. And an example I like to give is that of losing your keys. If you're not sure where your keys are, and let's say you need them now because you want to leave, really all you can do is guess where they might be. So maybe you left them on the kitchen counter. So that is a tentative solution to the problem. And then you can go look for them there. And if you don't find them there, then you know that your theory was false. And so you have to guess another solution. Maybe they're in your pocket or something. And if you find them there, that's great. Then you've made progress. So knowledge, even in the most mundane, scenarios like that, knowledge grows that way. And I do think that Popper was right about all of this. And I even like to think of him as the foremost artificial general intelligence researcher of this time, although I don't think he would have called himself that. But as should be expected, if we're Popperians and fallibilists, there are open problems with his epistemology. And these are some of the open problems, or the open problems I mentioned at the beginning are some of those. So just to reiterate them, those were, how does the mind create new conjectures? How does memory work? How do people evolve? And then the big one is consciousness. And to solve them, what I would like to suggest is the following, that if we can think of the biosphere as an arena of self-replicating genes, that analogously, we can think of the mind as an arena of self-replicating ideas. Now, having said that, there are still many important differences between the mind and the biosphere, so by no means do I want to equivocate those two, but I do think there are strong parallels that may help us explain some things. I should also mention, once I say replicating ideas, we may jump to memes, which are Richard Dawkins' idea of the cultural unit of a replicator. Those are not what I mean. Just to clarify, memes are ideas that replicate across minds. Memes are not just funny pictures on the internet. It's basically any idea that manages to jump from one mind to another, or at least enough minds that it becomes meaningful to call it a meme. So a joke is a meme, but also a catchy song could be a meme. With the example of the joke, I think this is an example David gives in his book. If the joke is good enough, then it causes the holder, the person who knows the joke, to tell it to somebody else. And so now the joke is in two minds, not just one. And that's why it's meaningful to call it a replicator. But again, I'm not talking about memes here. I'm only talking about ideas that replicate strictly within a single mind. So it can help, I think, to just think of a mind that's just cut off completely from the outside world to make things easier. So you can just imagine a brain in a vat, if you like. It doesn't have any access to the outside world. And still, I think there would be self-replicating ideas in the mind. It's also a nice way to make sure that we can't accidentally adopt any empiricist or inductivist notions if we just completely disregard sense data. And so I think with this simple premise that the mind is an arena of self-replicating ideas, we can now start solving the problems that I mentioned. And I think when it comes to the question of how people evolved, I would say that the evolution of the mind and the evolution of people is analogous to the origin of life in the biosphere. Because I'd like to suggest that the evolution of self-replicating ideas in a mind happened analogously to the evolution of self-replicating molecules in the primordial soup. And I think what happened is, well, so this is Popper again. So all organisms contain knowledge in the objective sense. Meaning, for example, wolves know how to hunt in packs and dogs know how to fetch balls, beavers know how to build dams and so forth. This all takes knowledge. all of these activities have the appearance of design. So we know that there must be knowledge behind them. And that knowledge is stored in their genes. And so we could just call the knowledge that results in these behaviors, we could call those ideas in the objective sense. And the set of all ideas that an organism has, I call its idea pool. And some of these ideas, I think, act just like the enzymes, those molecular catalysts from the primordial soup. They're able to make a change in other ideas within the same organism without undergoing any net change themselves. And in one of our ancestors, because of a genetic mutation, there was one such idea, one such catalyst that happened to promote the production of ideas of which it itself was made. A bit more technically speaking, you could say that it happened to promote the production of source code of which it itself was made. And then the same thing happened that happened in the primordial soup. Whenever that catalyst happened to become a little more targeted, it produced more of its components more faithfully, until, at some point you could say that it was targeted enough to meaningfully call it a replicator. Except this time it's not a molecule that self-replicates. It's not a material, a physical thing. It's an abstract thing. It's an idea. And this thing now replicates over and over during that single organism's lifetime. So in addition to biological evolution that we have happening, we now have what we could call mental evolution happening during that single organism's lifetime. I also call it runtime, the runtime of that software. And like I said, just like in the primordial soup, once you have replication, well, replication is not perfect forever. Even the best replicator makes mistakes every now and then. So sooner or later, variation and selection will kick in. And that's how you get evolution in a mind. And so that's how you get a dynamically changing idea pool, much like you have a dynamically changing gene pool in nature. And this is how this organism can now create new knowledge that was not genetically given. And that's something people do all the time. Everyone in this call is doing it right now. And I believe that what I've laid out is the underlying logic that allows them to do so. So we've solved now hopefully we've solved the problem of how people evolved. And the second problem also, which is where do conjectures come from? I think they're just the result of a long string of ideas replicating imperfectly, accidentally morphing into a new idea. And we can also explain now how memory works. Memory, as with so many things of the mind that are unfortunately explained on the level of the brain, memory is often explained on the level of neurons. And so I'm going to butcher it probably, but one idea that I've heard many times is that one set of neurons is said to encode one idea, and then if that set is wired to another bundle of neurons, then whenever one thinks of one also thinks of the other. So this is how associative memory is explained. And also they say that the more you think of those ideas, the stronger the physical connection of these neurons get. I think that's completely false. I think it's reductionist. And it also sounds a bit like there might just be a tinge of Lamarck's use and disuse theory sprinkled in there. But I think the reason it can't be true is that we know from computational universality, here I'm influenced by David Deutsch again, that we know from computational universality that we could simulate a mind on a computer, including that mind's memory, even if that computer hardware doesn't have any neurons, right? So you don't need neurons. We need to explain memory on the appropriate level of emergence, and that is software, not hardware. And I think with this approach, with the Neo-Darwinian approach, with the replicator approach, we can answer the question of how memory works. In the biosphere, some species survive for much longer than others, although it's really the genes that we're concerned with, not with the animals themselves. And I think the same is true in a mind. Some self-replicating ideas just manage to stick around longer in that mind's idea pool. And those replicators that are longer lived than others and happen to encode events from the past, those are the ones that we call memories. but there's nothing else that's special or different about them that separates them from other ideas. I think memories are usually thought of as a special class of idea. I certainly used to think of them that way, but I think that's wrong. And then when a certain population of ideas encoding memory dies out, let's say because they can't compete with rival ideas in that idea pool, then that's just what it means to forget something. And we can also explain why memories are so unreliable. It's because replication isn't perfect and mutations happen eventually. So memory is just an emergent phenomenon of that underlying pool of self-replicating ideas. And memory being unreliable is just a special case of knowledge being unreliable. And now just some small pointers for when it comes to consciousness. Why are we conscious of some things and not others? Popper conjectured that consciousness has to do with disappointed expectations. I think this was in his book, Objective Knowledge. If I recall correctly, he gave this example of walking up a flight of stairs, and if you get to the top and you think that there is one more step, but there isn't. We've all been there. It feels very weird, and you not only are you surprised at that sensation, but you also realize that you had an expectation that there was another step. And you wouldn't have realized that if there had been another step. So this is why Popper argues that consciousness may have to do with disappointed expectations. Something I'd like to add to that is that when we, for example, when we're children and we learn how to ride a bike, initially this process is a very conscious, effortful process. We're very aware of everything we're doing. We're aware of the pedaling. We're aware of keeping our balance. We're aware of steering and everything, because all of this requires error correcting. But as you get better at riding your bicycle, excuse me, as you get better at riding your bicycle, you become less aware of those things. And until now, now when I ride my bike, I don't really know how I do it anymore. I just do it, but I couldn't tell you how I keep my balance, for example. And that allows me to free up my attention and focus it on the road, for example, so that I can avoid potholes or avoid accidents. So it seems to me that consciousness has to do with error correction generally. And I'd also like to add this observation that I think what's curious is that despite the mutations of ideas that we know must be happening in our minds, because mutations are inevitable, we never seem to be aware of any junk ideas. But if mutations are usually detrimental and only rarely beneficial, that must mean that at any given moment, there are probably many of these junk ideas in our minds, but we're never aware of them. And I think that's curious. So I conjecture that maybe a necessary condition for something to enter our consciousness is that it be sufficiently adapted by some yet to be defined criterion. Now, to be clear, none of this explains consciousness by any means, and it's not meant to, but these are just some pointers. Something else that I think this approach allows us to do is we can start thinking, taking maybe what Richard Dawkins would have called the gene's eye view. Maybe we can take the ideas view, ideas eye view, I guess it would be called, and think about what it'd be like for an idea to live in that self-replicating pool of ideas. And we can think about different replication strategies that these ideas may have and what effect this could have on the mind. So now I do want to take it back to the level of memes for a moment. Dave Deutsch has conjectured that there are two different replication strategies for memes, static and dynamic. And I quote from The Beginning of Infinity, a dynamic meme is, quote, an idea that relies on the recipient's critical faculties to cause itself to be replicated, end quote. So these are ideas that, broadly speaking, help progress, and they help their holder make progress. They can, at least. And opposed to that are static memes or anti-rational memes. And those are, quote, an anti-rational meme is, quote, an idea that relies on disabling the recipient's critical faculties to cause itself to be replicated, end quote. So these are ideas that prevent criticism of themselves and thereby prevent their holder from making much progress. And so David Deutsch calls the societies that are dominated by either kind of those memes static versus dynamic societies. And so static societies, he says, are the kinds of societies which rarely ever change on timescales that the people living in those societies could notice. Whereas the dynamic societies change rapidly and they can make rapid progress because they're dominated by dynamic memes. So those are the memes, but what I wonder is if we could introduce the same replication strategies inside of minds. So instead of the level of society, we're now looking at the level of the mind with ideas being the individual actors, not people. Or I should say the self-replicating ideas in a mind being the actors, not memes being the actors. And so that could then lead us to identify, say, certain minds as static and certain minds as dynamic, or more or less of one or the other. And then we could think about how static minds differ from dynamic minds and maybe what that would mean for mental ailments and their alleviation. Given the damage that static memes can do to static societies, I would not be surprised if static ideas inside a mind can also do great damage to that mind. And I would expect a static mind to have a much harder time making progress than a dynamic mind. And perhaps, just like a static society, a mind that's dominated by static ideas would be overly concerned with, faithfully enacting some lifestyle and focusing too much on prevention strategies, which isn't sustainable. I'm borrowing here from Dave Deutsch again, which isn't sustainable because the mind would eventually encounter a problem that overwhelms it completely. So that's just an idea to play with. Maybe we can find something interesting there when it comes to replication strategies inside minds. And then one last thing that I'd like to mention is when it comes to the approach itself, is another reason or another explanation for why you cannot download an idea from one mind to another, which is a direct conclusion from Popper's critique of what he called instruction from without. It's not like we need another explanation, but I think this maybe illustrates a little more. So as a thought experiment, let's say that we have the technology to read people's minds or read their ideas somehow. It doesn't matter how it works, but let's say you somehow connect their brain to a computer interface, and then the program in that interface parses all the ideas in that brain and presents their source code to you. So you could read them technically. And let's just say that's a given. And let's say that you could then, via the same interface, you could connect to another person's brain, and you could just copy paste the idea from one brain to another. So technically, couldn't we say that would constitute a successful download of an idea from one mind to another? And maybe we could, but even if so, I think it still wouldn't refute what Popper meant when he said that instruction from without is impossible. And I think the reason is that the transferred idea, once you copy and paste that idea, it most likely will not make it in the new mind. It's a bit like taking a penguin from Antarctica and placing it in the African jungle. That penguin is not going to survive. Because I think our minds are all extremely different, just like extremely different ecosystems. So placing an idea from one mind to another, it's not going to make it. We shouldn't expect it to survive in the other mind. The idea, if we want to get the second mind to have that idea, a much better approach, I think, is to get that mind to evolve the idea itself. In other words, through persuasion. So this is the Neo-Darwinian approach, more or less, in a nutshell. What I'd like to do is respond to some criticism that the approach has received. And I'll start with Ella Hepner, who most notably has offered several different criticisms of the theory. One such criticism says that replication is wasteful. It's computationally wasteful. And so there wouldn't have been enough memory in our early ancestors' brains for ideas to replicate. And now I mean memory in the sense of storage space, not in the sense of remembering things. So my response to that is, I'm not sure that that is true. Many complex animals already seem to have enough spare memory to store additional information during their lifetimes. And in particular, our ancestors must have had enough memory, at least memory that was free at the time of birth, for them to copy and store relatively complex memes, at least complex compared to other animals' memes. Now, to be clear, they didn't replicate those memes creatively, because this is pre the evolution of minds. But as David Deutsch points out in the beginning of Infinity, meme evolution already drove the evolution of our ancestors. So there was already selection pressure favoring the development of ever more free memory in our ancestors' brains so that they could copy ever more complex memes. And that would have been space that our ancestors' self-replicating ideas could have used. On the note of memory, I would think that biological evolution, even long before the evolution of people, would have discovered basic memory management solutions, such as garbage collection, for example. Garbage collection, I don't have a computer science degree or anything, but my basic understanding is that garbage collection is, it's a way to monitor a program's memory usage and monitor its memory pressure. And if you only have so much memory available on your computer and your program is using, say, 95% of it, then the garbage collector will go in and look for any stale references to data that you're not using anymore, that the program isn't using anymore. And then it just deletes those references. Though I may be butchering it now, but I think that's the gist of it. And I would expect that evolution would have stumbled upon something like that much earlier, because it seems to me that any organism that can store additional information during its lifetime would eventually run into memory pressure issues. And so evolution must have evolved. There must have been a solution to this problem. Also, these increases in memory that I think are needed for those self-replicating ideas, they would have happened very gradually. So I'm not suggesting that once self-replicating ideas came on the scene within minds, that suddenly brains had plenty of extra storage. Certainly possible that initially there wasn't all that much extra memory to go around, but maybe just enough to help that adaptation spread. And then there was selection pressure, biological selection pressure to increase memory in humans' brains if that adaptation was helpful enough. By some accounts, there was a large and relatively sudden increase in memory in our evolutionary history. And I've heard theories that attribute that to a change in diet or upright posture or opposable thumbs and all that stuff. But it could also be possible that that increase in memory in our brains was caused by the selection pressure I've just described. And lastly, for this particular point, the claim that replication is wasteful or redundant in the sense of being unnecessary. It reminds me a bit of, although this criticism is not meant as a creationist standpoint, but it reminds me a bit of what a creationist might say about replication and biological evolution. A creationist might think that genes carrying the same knowledge millions of times over in each organism is unnecessary. To them, it might seem much more parsimonious and efficient to simply say that a single entity, God, for example, contains a single copy of all the knowledge that's required to create each organism, and then each organism is just the result of him doing that. Okay, then another criticism that Ella has offered is that self-replicating ideas, they sound dangerous. They could have led to all sorts of dangerous behavior in our ancestors, and so biological evolution would have selected against them. I don't think this is true either. I think animals around us are evidence that they contain sophisticated knowledge with enough reach, to use a Deutschian term, to guard against unwanted behavior. for example, being stuck in an endless loop or something. I've tried this. Even a well-behaved dog won't repeat a trick forever when instructed to. It'll only do it so many times. It just stops at some point. So there seem to be built-in criteria that can override erroneous behavior. So it seems to me that biological evolution has already has built-in safeguards. So self-replicating ideas wouldn't automatically have led to ever repeating behaviors or something that would, certainly cause death for the organism. I think actually the opposite is the case. Self-replicating ideas were then and are beneficial, and they help the gene spread that code for them. Excuse me. Because whenever there was a detrimental genetic mutation present in an organism that led to a bad mutation in one of those organism's ideas, it was thanks to those self-replicating ideas that there was an opportunity to replace that broken functionality with working functionality. And because detrimental mutations are much more numerous than beneficial ones, that actually means that the existence of self-replicating ideas was favored by biological evolution up to a rate at which detrimental mutations occur. So I think there would have been strong selective pressure in favor of self-replicating ideas in mind because it would have helped the gene spread. And then Ella has offered another approach that one could implement the same algorithm, say, the same self-replicating idea pool without replication. And the idea is basically to just have a single instance of each idea and a score or weight that you attribute to each, and then increasing and decreasing the weight as you go. And David Deutsch recently independently suggested this criticism as well. Now, it seems to me that denotationally, that sounds similar to my theory. And I think Ella in particular has in mind, although if she's here, she should correct me on this, but I think Ella in particular has in mind, what's his name? Donald Campbell's work on evolution, that you don't really need replication, so the argument goes. You just need variation and selection. Imperfect replication can be the source of variation, but it need not be. Now, I've said in the past, and I'm still of the opinion that I'm agnostic as to the question of necessity. But if we were to make this change, I think it would come at some cost. The one thing that I think the Neo-Darwinian approach, the approach that does adopt replication, brings to the table is that we can explain how people evolved. I'm not sure how we would do that because it allows us to explain with a very simple accidental small mutation. And I'm not sure this algorithm that would store and decrease weights, we would have to explain how that one came about. That seems to require a different explanation that I'm not aware, I'm not familiar with. And then the question is, when does it decide to mutate an idea, and why and how? And at which location in the idea source code? It also seems to me that such an algorithm would make planned mutations, but in real evolution, mutations are not planned. What I like about my approach is that none of these questions need to be answered in explicit programming. These are all just things that automatically fall out of having self-replicating ideas. So in a way, actually, structurally speaking, maybe it's the pool of self-replicating ideas that's more parsimonious, because you don't need to explicitly program any of these other things. And if the goal of that approach is to, get rid of replication because it might be wasteful or redundant or whatever, then the thing is, like, let's say you'd have one instance of an idea and you'd have a weight associated to it. And let's say at some point this master algorithm decides to make a copy of it and mutate it. And so at that point you would store a second entry. And over time you would get more and more entries in some registry of ideas or whatever. And I think then you would still get source code that is shared among many of these entries. And so it's a little bit similar to what Dawkins has pointed out with in regard to the cisterns and the DNA versus the genes, which he defines separately. The cisterns, or maybe butchering the term, but I think that's what it's called. The cisterns are like the actual section in the genome that code for eye color, say. Whereas the gene he defines as the longest possible stretch of the genome that gets replicated over and over without changes. You'd get a very similar phenomenon in this registry of ideas where you'd have sections of those ideas that stay the same across those entries. And then that would be the replicator. So although the idea set out to get rid of replication, I'm not sure it actually does. And I think what's nice about adopting replication is that it gives us consistency with other evolutionary phenomena that we know exist and we know are powered by replication. That's biological evolution and meme evolution. And I think that consistency is valuable because it means that we can share knowledge between these different disciplines. So I like to think that this Neo-Darwinian approach has a unifying character, and I think that's worth keeping. And we couldn't investigate the static and dynamic replication strategies in the mind anymore without replication. Those really are replication strategies, and they don't work without replication. And then the last criticism that I'm familiar with that Ella has offered is that it's unclear how the mind creates and discovers problems and contradictions, and that's the driving force of creativity. So that's a really important thing to answer. And I agree with that. So I want to clarify. My current idea is that when there are populations of ideas that are competing in a mind, especially when they compete fiercely over resources, memory, for example, then that leads to cognitive dissonance, the cognitive dissonance that we experience when we experience a problem. And depending on the nature or the fierceness of the competition, that we may, a problem may seem interesting or annoying or downright depressing, like I said, depending on the nature of the competition. And then when we solve such a conflict, it could mean, for example, that there's a third population of ideas that has evolved and operates as a sort of mediator, enabling the two conflicting populations to coexist peacefully, or it could fight and win against both populations and largely replace them. I think that's what might be happening when you have one theory that supersedes and explains two conflicting ones, which then live on in the new theory as approximations. Or it could just enable one of the two to win over the other. And then recently, David Deutsch suggested that we need not mimic how biological evolution created creativity, the same way that planes don't need to mimic birds to fly. And I agree with that. I don't know of any other way yet. Yeah, and I forget if I mentioned it, but he also, just like Ella Hepner, suggested that replication would be inefficient, that it wouldn't be necessarily the approach that a programmer would take. So all these criticisms have been very helpful and have motivated me to think more about this idea. But what strikes me is that I think none of these are conclusive criticisms. And this brings me to something that many of them have in common. I think they're along the lines of, they say something like self-replicating ideas are not necessary to explain the mind. And like I said, I agree with that. In fact, I'm pretty certain that my approach is wrong. What I'd like to find out is why. And I think an avenue that I would find more productive is what is an explanation for why self-replicating ideas cannot be part of the mind, not why they need not. And like a real refutation of the idea would be extremely helpful. That also brings me to what could change my mind about this approach. That is one of them, just an explanation of why it cannot involve self-replicating ideas. And then also an internal contradiction or something like that I'm unable to fix. At least that would definitely constitute a big problem that I would need to solve. I should point out that the idea that self-replication, for example, would have hurt the genes encoding that it would have hurt genes in biological evolution. I think that was a candidate for why creativity cannot involve self-replicating ideas. So I think something like that would be promising. And then lastly, some outstanding problems. There are still big unknowns left. Like I said, consciousness is the big one. Something that I've been thinking about recently is that when the approach kind of goes along the lines of, well, as long as you have self-replicating ideas, you kind of get variation automatically eventually because the mind is messy, and therefore you also get selection automatically because different variants spread at different rates. But if you actually write a self-replicating computer program, they're also called a quine. They don't ever mutate. You can run them a billion times in a row. They don't mutate, and unless you force them to, but then mutations are planned. So that tells me that the self-replicating programs that people have written are too good at replication for evolution to occur. And then there's the problem with evolutionary algorithms generally that David Deutsch has written about in The Beginning of Infinity, which is that as a programmer, you can't really tell if the knowledge that you find in the program after running it is knowledge that the program created itself, or if that is knowledge that you as a programmer just happen to put into it without realizing it. You leak that knowledge into the program. And so you can't really judge whether the program is creative. You'd need to know to make that call. So we need to find a solution for that before even trying to implement this theory. And yeah, so that is the approach. And I'd be ready to take questions if there are any.
Great, thanks so much for the talk. Yeah, so we have about 45 minutes of questions. And I think what we'll do is, Dennis, if you could first close the presentation, because I think it's nice if...
Oh, yeah. Go back to...
And then, as usual, I will open with a question, and then anyone who wants to ask a question can do so afterwards, either by raising your hand, as I see David has done, or by typing in the chat. Yeah, so the first question I had was, I really like the idea set out, and I like especially your explanation of memory, and this idea that memories are replicators, and the memories that you retain are the ones that have replicated best. But memory in my computer is just accessible. Like the files in my computer don't replicate. If I require an old file, I get an exact copy of that file, and I just retrieve it as it was when I first stored it. Why do you think that minds store memories differently? Why do you think that they will have to replicate?
Yes, I think it's sort of a quirk maybe of the English language that we use the term memory to refer to both of these phenomena, even though I think they describe different things. Memory in the second sense, in the sense that your computer uses, actually our brains have too, because they need to store data in that sense. And that is just the plain old memory storage that you've described, and nothing changes. Like if I store, very rarely, because our hard drives are very reliable. So yeah, if you store a file on your computer, it just stays there and it doesn't replicate. So this is, I think that is like a lower level kind of memory phenomenon, like the direct interaction with the hardware for how to store information. The kind of memory in the sense of remembering things, I think it's just a different phenomenon. So, and that is the phenomenon that involves the self-replicating ideas. So I would just distinguish between the two.
Very nice. Okay, thanks for your answer. Then I see that David has a raised hand. Dave, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. Well, I too found that very persuasive, and I also liked the way that it kind of explains features that would otherwise perhaps seem accidental features of the human mind and memory as well. I just I can't quite see the overall picture though. So in RNA world, there were, as it were, genes, but no organisms.
Right.
And in the brain, in your picture, I think there's also genes, but no organisms. Is that right? First of all,
Yes, that is right. I've wondered if maybe sometimes ideas, as they get more complex, as they replicate in the mind, if they stumble upon a replication strategy, something like the genes stumbled upon when they invented organisms.
well, yeah. Well, so the thing is that if you imagine a huge soup of RNA, then it doesn't have an outside world. That is the only outside world is it interacts with is other RNA molecules. Things started happening in RNA world to make more sophisticated replicators when RNA started manipulating things that aren't RNA. And started, for example, making enzymes, making proteins, and so on. So like, I would guess that there's only so far you can get by twisting RNA into different shapes and trying to get them to produce more of those. But at some point, they invented enzymes, and then from then on, there's phenotypes, there's organisms. I'm not asking how you explain the origin of species. Why a bunch of DNA just moves along through the world together. It's not that. It's the when it gets to encounter the non-RNA world. And I think most selection in the biosphere and most selection in the brain, I'm guessing, is caused by problems to do with the outside world. Mm-hmm. It's the outside world that causes things in the inner world to come into conflict.
Right. Okay.
I'm just kind of asking for comment or whatever. I mean, I don't have any objection to the idea. I think it's a great idea, and please pursue it.
Great. No, I think that is a really helpful pointer. That is, I don't have an answer off the bat for you for that. I think that's something I'd very much like to explore. So I'll keep thinking about it.
Okay. Can't ask for more.
Ooh. Then Timothy, do you have a raised hand?
Yeah. Hi, Dennis. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Hi.
I think one term that I'm sort of stumbling over in this framework is accidental. How do you think about our sort of effectiveness at problem solving, or the kind of deliberateness of it, in terms of this accidental idea creation?
Do I understand correctly that you're trying to square the purposeful thinking, or at least the purposeful, the feeling that we get that we're purposefully solving a problem, say, with the notion that ideas mutate accidentally? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, I mean, not just the feeling, the fact that we actually approach problems and solve them.
Right. I've thought about this too, and I think it's a really interesting thing to explore. I think those things can be squared, I think the way we introspect and look at the way we solve problems is often deceptive. And this has led to ideas such as induction, for example, where people, even though they could not have induced from experience, that's what they thought they did. So people can be mistaken about what they're doing when they solve problems. And the thing that ideas happen to morph into a new conjecture that solves a problem, say, I think isn't really at odds with purposeful problem solving. We want to solve problems. That means we have ideas that we would like. When there's a conflict, we would like to solve it. And that idea exists even before we encounter a solution to a problem. But the solution to the problem itself, we can't really move toward in a targeted fashion because we don't know yet what it might be. It's unknowable in advance. We only know it once we've evolved it. And at that point, we just kind of happen to know it. I think that's just true of evolution generally, is whether it's the gene or the self-replicating idea in a mind. There's only, I think Popper called them happy accidents. There's only happy accidents, or sometimes not so happy ones. That's, I think, all we have. We can't think of a solution before that idea mutates into one. Does that make sense? I'm not sure that I really put my finger on your question.
I am not hearing the participants.
Sorry, that does make sense. I'm not sure if it quite fills the gap for me, but yeah, I'm not sure of a better way of framing it, but thanks for your response.
Okay, sure.
Okay, then I see you have two more raised hands. I don't know who was first. I think I'll go with Paurik. I think I'm mispronouncing your name. If so, sorry. But go ahead.
That's all right. Yeah, that's Paurik. Thanks a million. Really enjoyed the talk, Dennis. Thanks a lot for it. So yeah, my question was sort of related to the last question a little bit, but you remarked, I think about halfway through the talk, about there may be, because ideas will self-replicate, there will be these junk ideas, which are analogous in some ways to junk DNA. So I guess my question is about the self-replication. So within this model, is the replication a matter of degree, so that the idea which isn't the junk idea, which presumably is the one that we're then conscious of, because you're mentioning that we there's a lot that we're unconscious of, and those would be the sort of the ridiculous answers, let's say, to a problem, or the ones that don't get promoted into our awareness. But the ones we are aware of, would those be more active replicators in this way, or they're so yeah, I guess it's sort of a two-part question. One is, like, is the replication a matter of degree, and secondly, are the ones we become conscious of the sort of better at causing their copying?
Yeah, I'll try to answer the second one first. I think being better at copying oneself is one way to just retain the faithfulness and the coherence of an idea, for sure. So that if that idea wants, and scare quotes, to be thought of again, a good way to do that is to make sure that one retains one's faithfulness. I could see that. Now, with regard to whether that makes it a more active replicator, I don't know. I could certainly imagine that there are ideas with different replication rates. One might replicate twice as often as the other. And if it can make up for the mutations that might be introduced during the double replication, then it's fine. So I guess it just depends on how reliable a replicator it is. Or it is not very reliable, but thanks to those mutations, it creates a new idea. And then that new idea is coherent enough that you become aware of it. So that could also be the case. So I'm not sure that we could tie it to the activity of a replicator per se. With regard to your first question, I'm not sure what you mean by degree of replication.
Yeah, I guess just to clarify it a little bit. So, you know, so to bring it back to the analogy within genes, there will be the junk DNA is a replicator of sorts, although it's not usually referred to as a replicator because it's not. You know, it would contribute within its environment. It contributes to its copying more than, you know, a whole lot of other physical objects. But it's you know, it's for some, it's maybe not worth calling a replicator because it does so far less well than the ones we call replicators. So I was just wondering if that's the same sort of implication that was being drawn between the analogy of junk ideas and junk DNA, that they're still self-replicating, but they're less less good at it.
I got you. Yeah, no, I think absolutely that could happen. Yeah, you could through mutation, you could get a junk idea it's junk in the sense that it doesn't result in a coherent idea anymore, but it still kind of manages to get itself replicated every now and then. That could happen. Or sometimes a mutation might be so detrimental that it dies immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Then I see Danny has a raised hand. Danny, go ahead.
Hi, Dennis. I really enjoyed the talk as well. And one of the things that I really like about this theory, which is something that I've wondered about myself in the past, is the fact that Popper's notion where we conjecture ideas. I've always wondered why the ideas that appear in our conscious mind seem to be non-random. You know, so to take your example about the keys, you know, some silly idea about your keys being somewhere that you've never been before, that idea doesn't appear in your mind. So I suppose my question would be, do you have any conjectures around what is happening in the mind in that moment when that first idea appears in your conscious mind? Do you so what is happening when your mind, quote unquote, selects one idea to present to you consciously? Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I have. And one idea that I've just played with is that maybe what's happening is that in the pocket of the population of ideas that's relevant to this problem, maybe the idea that you've left your keys on the kitchen counter is just very good at spreading through this pocket, and it outnumbers rivals. And that's why it gains a foothold in that niche. And maybe that is why you become aware of it. This is just a, purely conjectural, I'm making stuff up kind of thing. But that's an idea I've played with.
So more broadly, then you think it might be possible that the distinction between, the ideas in the conscious mind and the ideas in the unconscious mind has something to do with, we'll say, the number of replicas of an idea, or am I maybe stretching what you just said a small bit?
Well, I think it may have to do with that, and it may have to do with one idea outnumbering or overwhelming, or one population of that idea, like one set of replicas of that idea outnumbering another competing set, and that's why you don't think of the other set. I think that is one thing. And then, as I've mentioned, there's the thing about ideas competing fiercely and that constituting a problem. That is also something that I become aware of. I would imagine that there are ideas competing all the time, countless ideas competing all the time in our minds, but the competition is so small, and the conflict is so small that you don't realize it. But because the key, in the key example, the missing key, it must mean that just by virtue of you thinking and recognizing it as a problem, it could mean that there were two populations of ideas encoding conflicting preferences. Say, one, I want to leave, that is my preference, conflicting with the idea that I can't find my key, so I can't leave. And this conflict is on both sides. The ideas are numerous enough that the conflict is noticeable. That it's a bit circular, because I'm trying to explain what we notice in terms of what is noticeable. But I'm suggesting that that is what makes it noticeable. If that makes, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see other raised hands, so I will ask another question. And it has to do with these higher level concepts. So we also, like, you draw this picture of single ideas evolving in a mind, and partly you say that, for example, we experience suffering as a consequence of competition between ideas. And I think what I'm wondering is, like, where does the sense of self come in, and where does this is kind of related to the question of where does conscious problem solving come in? And because surely, I mean, I can imagine there would be such an explanation of consciousness, or of maybe that's asking too much, but where do these seemingly higher level entities come in? The sense of self, sense of direction, sense of purpose. And yeah, it's kind of a vague question, that it's pointing at something. I hope it's enough.
No, it's a great question. Yeah, I'm afraid it really is the big one. I don't have any good answers for you. I mean, I have thought that there is a sort of meta algorithm in the mind that we've inherited from our ancestors that used to just be responsible for interrupting, bad loops or stuff like that. But and maybe that is because it looks over the pool of replicating ideas. That maybe that is why we have this. At least that's how we feel, that we have this bird's eye view of our ideas. But I don't know. I would really like to know.
Cool. Yeah, same. But it's, yeah, as I said, it's maybe too big of a question. I see that there's more raised hands now. And I think Antonio was first. So Antonio, if you want to ask a question, go ahead.
That's right, thank you. So I don't want to get into a play of definitions, but what do you mean when you say an idea? And do you differentiate between the explicit content or the inexplicit content? Do you think it matters at all how they are instantiated in the brain? What would be like the goal of an idea? Why wouldn't it want to exist in your brain in the first place? Because unless you actually define what you mean by idea, having self-replicating ideas doesn't say much about what's going on.
So what stood out to me is when you said, why would an idea want to be in a mind? I don't think it does. The same way that there's no gene that wants to be in the biosphere. It just kind of finds itself there, and because it's a replicator, it makes ever more of itself. There's nothing, on the level of the replicator, there is no consciousness or purposefulness. So now, when it comes to what do these ideas actually look like? How are they implemented? I have given this some thought. Now, at the risk of it getting too technical, I think of ideas, the way they're stored in the brain when it comes to source code, as functions in the sense of the lambda calculus. And I do think there are important parallels between, or not just parallels, I actually think they're the same, between functions in the sense of the lambda calculus and explanations. And so I use the term idea just for those functions. For just those functions, I should say. So that would be my technical answer to how are ideas implemented in the mind, if that helps.
Okay, if you imagine a brain, a human brain, okay, human baby raised without language, okay? In 2021, now you can raise a human being without speaking to it, to him or her, whatever. Do you think that it will contain knowledge? Will it only contain like inexplicit knowledge, but it will be able to move around, to hunt, to eat, to feed, to interact with other human beings purely on an inexplicit level?
Yeah, I think so. I
mean, our ancestors at some point were in that stage, right? Before the invention of language. Presumably they had the same brain, the same genes.
Yeah, no, I do think that language comes after. You have creativity, and that's what allows you to learn language. It's not the other way around. So yeah, I think there's plenty of things that people can learn even without language, and the inexplicit ideas will do.
And would the mechanism of how they learn all these inexplicit ideas be different to how they learn explicit ideas?
I don't think so. I think the method, in scare quotes, of conjecture and criticism is universal. I mean, yeah, I think it will work the same for explicit ideas as for inexplicit ideas.
And wouldn't it be more easy if the mechanism is the same to try to explain how we learn inexplicit ideas before jumping to the explicit ones and having all these extra dimensions of language, of science, all these meta levels?
I would agree, yeah.
Okay, I'll pause here and maybe we can go there later. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
okay, hi, Dennis. I missed the beginning of your talk, but I think this is a really important line of inquiry, and I applaud you for exploring this. I feel like the area which needs to be fleshed out more is the selection mechanism. And I wanted to mention that there is an existing theory called neural Darwinism, but it seems to be that theory is more in to explain perception rather than the formation of ideas. And in neural Darwinism, the idea is you have basically a bunch of, when in a newborn brain, it's known like you have tons of random connections, and then there's sort of a pruning process. And the idea of neural Darwinism is the different groups of neurons are selected by how faithfully they replicate the incoming sensory data streams. With your theory, you were talking about more of an internal process, right? So I was thinking, wouldn't you need some kind of like world simulator to test different ideas to see if they make sense? And like, have you thought about how there might be like a world simulator, and then basically, so for example, with the missing keys example, which is a really interesting example, different parts of your brain would be simulating different scenarios and sort of seeing if they if the idea, if the simulation maps onto the idea, like you'd have different ideas. Like you'd have an idea the keys are in location X, and then you'd run a simulation based on all the information you know, and you see if it confirms that idea. Have you thought about anything like that?
Well, just to give a general answer, as I said earlier, I like to just leave sense data out of it completely. I mean, I do think that sense data is important to test your theories, but so to make progress, sense data is important in that sense. But I don't think sense data is required for creativity to work, or for any of the evolution that occurs in the mind to work. And I mean, you could simply ask, if somebody is born, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, I think David does this in the beginning of Infinity, and if somebody is born blind, they're not any less creative. I mean, they're still people. They're fully qualified people, right? So they might have a harder time correcting some errors because they don't have access to sense data from the eyes, but then they might creatively find other ways to correct those errors. But what I like to do is just leave sense data out of it completely, just to avoid any empiricist pitfalls. I also like to leave the brain out of it completely. I like to think only in terms of the mind, just to avoid any accidental reductionist mistakes. So I, you know, the thing about neuronal structure is self-replicating. I don't know.
I was more just mentioning that for the audience's benefit. I'm not saying that you should go in that direction. I actually think the direction you're going, which is more at the higher level, abstracting away from the neural circuitry is very interesting. I guess my question was really about the selection mechanism. Like, could you elaborate more? Because so far on the selection mechanism, because so far I mean, at least for the part I heard, you just mentioned, you know, some will be better at replicating than others, but what is the selection? How does selection occur? Is it context dependent, or is there some? How does that work?
Yeah. So again, borrowing Dawkins' definition of selection, that is, it's the non-random differential reproduction of a replicator in a pool of replicators. That is how I would describe the selection effect, or the selection mechanism in the pool of self-replicating ideas in the mind as well. It's just the fact that once a mutation arises, if the mutation either helps or harms the new copy's ability to spread, now you have differences in the rate of replication, and that itself constitutes selection. In addition to that, this meta algorithm, which, by the way, I caught myself not crediting the idea of the meta algorithm originated with Elliot Temple in a different context, but the meta algorithm could also have, you know, act as a sort of arbiter of ideas, or select, or arbiter is maybe the wrong word, but impose additional selection pressures on the idea pool. Now, how in detail that would work, I think, depends on what happens at runtime, because it might look at some ideas for what to do and what selection pressures to enact on the idea pool itself. So there's some kind of feedback loop there. But the details of it, the kinks, I think, need to be worked out there.
Okay, then we have two questions in the chat by Taha. The first one is, in the case of genes, RNA, DNA, we know what the replication unit is made of, a sequence of nucleotides. What constitutes the replication unit of an idea?
Yes, this is a great question. I would follow Dawkins here, who says, well, on the one hand, we have the physical instance of the replicator, which is the molecular structure itself. So actually, the terminology I use is that I would call an instance of the replicator, a physical instance of that replicator. And although maybe I'm jumbling biological terms, but I would consider even that physical instance of that string of molecules itself part of that replicator's phenotype, which may sound a bit confusing until you realize that the replicator itself is actually an abstraction. The replicator is not physical. It has physical instantiations, but the replicator is an abstraction because, as Dawkins explains, the replicator is that part of this string of DNA that manages to stay the same over many, many generations for as long as possible. And so this is just a chain of instances, and that, of course, that chain physically exists, but it also exists over time. And so some of the older chains, the older part of the chain would already be gone at that point, and still we would consider all that part of the same replicator. So it's abstract. Those are independent of the physical instantiation. But so the unit of replication, in that sense, we could ask the same question also when it comes to memes. In the mind, I think are again again, at the risk of sounding too technical, the functions in the sense of the lambda calculus, these little programs. Just think of them as programs, really. those are the ones that replicate. And of course, they're going to have a physical instantiation in the physical memory, now again in the sense of storing stuff, not in the sense of remembering stuff, in the brain. I think Dawkins even went so far as to say one time that he proposed this conjecture that maybe if you have a joke in your mind and I have a joke in my, or in your brain and I have a joke in my brain, that maybe that means that the neuronal structures encoding that joke are the same. So maybe meme replication implies replication of neuronal structures across brains or something. Actually, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the replication unit of an idea is the function in the sense of the lambda calculus. Hope that helps.
Yes, I think that makes sense. Just to get a clearer picture for myself, do you mean that there is something that you and I have in common when we have the same idea in our minds, or that we have a similar idea, when we have the same joke, then whatever is encoding that joke in our brains has to be fundamentally the same thing. Like it is encoding the same abstraction, as you would say. And it might do so differently. It might use a different encoding, but they're both encoding the same abstractions. And in that sense,
yeah, provided that enough error correction has gone into it, I agree. The abstraction that encodes the idea in your mind should be roughly, at least, similar to the encoding in my mind. Yes.
Right. Okay, and then there's a second question, also from Taha, which goes: knowing that the sequence of a gene allows us to target it with a strip of DNA, how can we do the same and target a specific idea?
Yeah, that's also a really great question. Well, maybe we can go back to the thought experiment I suggested earlier with the brain interface that allows you to connect to someone's brain and read the source code. I don't know how exactly you would do that, but if you somehow manage to, and I think that process itself would involve conjecture and refutation. So the brain interface may need to be a person, but if somehow you manage to do that and you can turn the zeros and ones in the brain somehow back into functions, represent them as functions in the sense of the lambda calculus, then what you could do is at any point in that source code, you could make modifications or split it or put something new in there. All that stuff would be available to you. Seems to me a challenge to make that happen, that interface.
Great. Then, yeah, we're almost through the 45 minutes, and I don't see any further questions, unless someone has them now, in which case, please go ahead and ask. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if you don't mind me asking a second one, that's okay. So I was just wondering about so do you think a conflict or problems are a necessary precondition for a conjecture? Or, because I was thinking about in order for us to identify a problem, would we first need to conjecture that a problem exists? So in other words, there's let's take a simplistic, probably unrealistically simplistic case. There's two conflicting ideas, and we're conjecturing solutions to that problem. Do we need to conjecture that there is a problem? And then just as a related idea, in order to conjecture anything, in order for any new variation of an idea to come about, does that kind of conflict need to exist, if that makes sense?
I think the answer is no, because new ideas will just evolve by virtue of replication being imperfect over time. Mm-hmm. But when there is a conflict between ideas, that certainly helps. And I would imagine that at least that is the main thing, like I said, that we're consciously aware of when we do come up with a new conjecture, it is because it is in response to a problem. So I still think that problems are the raw material of creativity and so forth. But strictly speaking, no, conjectures could arise just by virtue of imperfect replication.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Any other questions? Antonio, go ahead.
Thank you. Do you think there's a difference between the perception of a problem, so this conflict between ideas, and sensory perception in general?
Could you elaborate a little more?
Yeah. Do you think there is, I mean, when you realize that there is a conflict between two ideas, isn't this something you perceive via your senses? Is it a different physical structure, say from vision, or from looking at the screen, or recognizing a bicycle? When you recognize that there is a problem between two ideas, do you think it's a different object in a way than recognizing a physical object around you?
I think those are different things. When we experience a problem,
experience, yeah.
Right. When we experience a problem, I mean, maybe I use the term experience differently, but the sensation we have, sensation is also a tricky term because it has sense in it, but the sensation we have when we experience a problem, this cognitive dissonance, need not result from sense data. It certainly can happen that you're, with an optical illusion, for example, you think you're looking at one thing, but it's actually another, and you can change, if you change your perspective, you see, and then you experience that problem. That's the problem you want to solve. But the experience of the problem itself, as all experience, I think, is entirely within. That is not something that is induced somehow by sensory data. And again, if
I agree, but they're both inside. Both when you perceive a bicycle on the road and when you perceive a problem in your mind, both of them are inside you. That's what I'm saying. Is there a difference?
Yes, I think there's still a difference. When you just look at a bicycle and say you have, I imagine that children learn this when they're very young. They creatively conjecture recognition algorithms, like shape recognition algorithms, so that later they can recognize bicycles. That stuff just happens automatically. Once you see it, once you've created that algorithm, you just recognize bicycles, unless you're horribly deformed or something. Whereas when you have a problem, there's something unknown there. There's something mysterious there. So I still think those are qualitatively different experiences. If that's what you're getting at, I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Okay, I don't think there is a difference, but yeah.
Well, can you elaborate? What is it you think that is the same about it?
I mean, at some point, to a child, seeing a bicycle was a mystery, in the same way that when you think about supernovae or whatever, it's a mystery for you.
Right.
There is no automatic thing going on. I mean, if at some point, because if you're never exposed to a bicycle, then you can be as old as you want, but at some point you will be mystified by this new object. So
I see. Yeah, no, I think you're right that when for the first time you see a bicycle, that is a mystery. What is that thing? How does it work? And how would I recognize it again? At like that first time, you're confronted with a problem and you want to solve that problem. And in response to it, you learn about the bicycle and you come up with a shape recognition algorithm for the bicycle and so forth. But once you have that, now it's automatic. Now you can just recognize bicycles again. If I look out the window and I see a bicycle, that doesn't constitute a problem. So I would still consider those two different things.
Well, fair enough.
Yeah, I think, aren't they just the same thing, only one is subjected to empirical criticism and the other is just an internal idea?
Yeah, I mean, your internal ideas, aren't they criticism? How do you experience? How do you think? Don't you visualize your objections to something? Why do we need to distinguish between these two worlds?
It's the same distinction as between science and philosophy, I think. And it's not really a distinction, it's just a matter of where do the criticisms come from. And It's useful in some cases, but this is not a fundamental distinction, I think. I'm not sure if Dennis agrees with that, but this is how I would understand that.
I do, although I still have the feeling that I can't quite put my finger on what's her name, Antonio's question. So I feel that I haven't really answered it satisfactorily.
Yeah, well, maybe topic for future discussion. I'm afraid we've run out of time though, and yeah, I just want to thank Dennis for his great talk. I'll do so as usual with applauding an emoji. There you go. And
no, it was a lot of fun. It was great to be here.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming. And again, I encourage everyone to check out your article on the Conjecture Magazine website, which we'll link to in the description of the video. And yeah, so thank you for Logan for helping arrange this.
Thank you and good luck.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Goodbye.
All right.
Thanks
Bye, everybody.